In the suffocating heat of a Birmingham summer, 71-year-old retired librarian Eleanor Mae Harrison was about to discover that loyalty to family could be a one-way street. What started as helping with her diabetic medication costs would end with her own daughter declaring her a financial burden too heavy to bear. But Eleanor Mae had spent 43 years teaching children to find strength in stories, and she was about to write the most unexpected chapter of her own life, one that would make her indispensable to the very people her family considered their sworn enemies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The humidity hung thick as molasses in the cramped mobile home on the outskirts of Tuscaloosa, where Eleanor Mae Harrison had been living for the past 18 months since her husband Chester's funeral. The rusted air conditioning unit wheezed and rattled, fighting a losing battle against Alabama's merciless July heat, much like Eleanor Mae herself had been fighting a losing battle against her daughter's mounting resentment. Patricia Patty Harrison Webb had inherited her father's sharp tongue but none of his compassion. At 48, she carried herself with the bitter authority of someone who'd spent years blaming the world for her disappointments. A failed marriage to a gambling addict, 2 teenagers who barely tolerated her presence, and a job at the county assessor's office that paid just enough to keep them all trapped in mediocrity. Eleanor Mae folded the last of the laundry with practiced precision, her arthritic fingers moving slowly but steadily through the familiar motions. The prescription bottle on the kitchen counter caught the morning light, its orange plastic surface bearing the stark white label that had become the source of so much tension. Insulin Glargine. $847.23. Insurance covered most of it. But that remaining $200 monthly copay might as well have been $2,000 for all the strain it put on their household budget. The sound of Patty's car door slamming echoed across the gravel driveway like a gunshot. Eleanor Mae's hands stilled on the towel she'd been folding, her body instinctively tensing for whatever storm was about to break through the front door. She'd learned to read the signs, the particular screech of brakes that meant her daughter had received another bill, the heavy footsteps that spoke of frustration looking for a target. "Mama!" Patty's voice cut through the sweltering air, sharp enough to make the neighbor's dog start barking. "We need to talk. Right now!" Eleanor Mae set down the towel and smoothed her cotton dress, a faded blue thing with tiny yellow flowers that Chester had always said brought out her eyes. She'd worn it today not from vanity but from habit, clinging to the small dignities that made her feel human when everything else conspired to make her feel like a burden. Patty burst through the screen door, her work clothes wilted from the heat, and her face flushed with more than just the temperature. In her hand, she clutched a manila envelope with the telltale return address of Jefferson County Medical Center. Eleanor Mae's heart sank as she recognized the familiar weight of medical bills in her daughter's white-knuckled grip. $847, Patty announced without preamble, waving the bill like evidence in a criminal trial. $847 for insulin this month. Do you know what that means to this family, Mama? Do you have any idea what we're giving up so you can stick yourself with needles twice a day? Eleanor Mae felt the familiar knot form in her stomach, the same twist of shame and helplessness that had become her constant companion since moving into Patty's home. She'd tried so hard to be helpful, to earn her place through service, cooking meals, cleaning house, watching her grandchildren when they'd still lived here before moving in with their father in Mobile. But each doctor's visit, each prescription refill, had gradually transformed her from helpful grandmother to financial albatross. "I know it's expensive, honey," Eleanor Mae said quietly, hating how small her voice sounded in the overheated room. "The doctor said we could try switching to a different kind, but last time you ended up in the emergency room," Patty interrupted, her voice rising with frustration. $1,200 we didn't have for an ambulance ride because the cheap insulin made your blood sugar crash. So now we're stuck paying premium prices for medicine that keeps you alive, while the rest of us can't even afford to live." The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully aimed at Eleanor Mae's deepest fears. She'd spent her career helping children find their voices, encouraging shy students to speak up, and brilliant minds to reach higher. Now, at 71, she found herself rendered voiceless by her own daughter's cruelty. "I contribute what I can from my Social Security," Eleanor Mae said, her teacher's training helping her maintain composure even as her heart shattered. I pay for groceries when I can, I help around the house. Help around the house? Patty's laugh was harsh, brittle. Mama, you eat our food. You use our electricity. You take up space in what used to be my sewing room. And now this. She slammed the medical bill onto the coffee table, its impact echoing through the small room like a judge's gavel. Eleanor Mae looked at the bill, at the numbers that had become the arithmetic of her worth in her daughter's eyes. $847.23 for the insulin that kept her heart beating, her mind clear, her body functional. Such a small amount in the grand scheme of medical costs, but apparently too much for a mother's life to be worth. What do you want me to do? The question came out as a whisper, though Eleanor Mae wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Patty was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the trailer park that stretched toward the tree line, a collection of hopes and dreams reduced to their most basic components: shelter, survival, getting by from one month to the next. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that had been building for months. I think it's time you considered other living arrangements. The words hung in the humid air like smoke from a house fire, visible and choking. Eleanor Mae felt the room spin slightly, her diabetic body responding to stress the way it always did, with weakness, with the kind of exhaustion that went bone deep. Other arrangements? Eleanor Mae repeated, though she understood perfectly. She'd seen this conversation coming like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, had felt the shift in Patty's attitude with each mounting bill, each financial crisis that somehow became Eleanor Mae's fault. There are places, Patty said, avoiding her mother's eyes. Nice places. Assisted living facilities, where you'd have people your own age to talk to, activities, medical care, right there on site. It might be better for everyone. On my Social Security? Eleanor Mae felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. Patty, you know those places cost 3 times what I get each month. Have you looked at the prices? There are subsidized ones. And maybe… Patty paused, her next words clearly rehearsed. Maybe it's time to consider selling Daddy's workshop. All those tools just sitting there in the shed. Worth probably $10,000 if we sold them to the right person. That could give you a little nest egg to get started somewhere. Eleanor Mae's breath caught in her chest. Chester's workshop, the sacred space where her husband had spent countless hours crafting furniture for their home, for their neighbors, for anyone who needed something built with love and care. The place where their grandchildren had learned to use their hands, where Chester had passed on the skills his own father had taught him during the Depression. You want me to sell your father's tools? Eleanor Mae's voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of 46 years of marriage, of memories that couldn't be reduced to dollar signs in an estate sale. I want you to be realistic about your situation, Patty replied, finally meeting her mother's eyes. I can't keep bleeding money for your medical expenses while my own kids need things. Tyler wants to play football this year. That's equipment, fees, everything. Melissa needs a car if she's going to keep her job at the Sonic. I have to think about their futures, not just your present. The mention of her grandchildren sent a fresh wave of pain through Eleanor Mae's chest. Tyler, 16 and full of dreams about earning a football scholarship. Melissa, 18, and working 2 jobs to save for community college. Children she'd helped raise, whose homework she'd supervised, whose tears she'd dried when Patty was too busy or too tired or too angry to notice they needed comfort. What about the children? Eleanor Mae asked. They'll want to visit, they'll want to see. The children will be fine, Patty said firmly. They'll adjust. Kids are resilient. But Eleanor Mae knew better. She'd spent 4 decades watching children navigate their parents' decisions, had seen how quickly they learned to adapt to abandonment, how efficiently they built walls around their hearts to protect against the next disappointment. Tyler and Melissa would smile and say they understood, would maybe even feel relieved not to witness their grandmother's slow slide into unwantedness. But they'd learned something about loyalty, about how love had conditions and expiration dates. How long do I have? Eleanor Mae asked, her teacher's instincts making her focus on practical details, even as her world crumbled around her. 3 weeks, Patty said, and there was something that might have been relief in her voice, as if saying it out loud had freed her from a burden she'd been carrying. "I know it seems fast, but I've been thinking about this for months. It's better to just rip the bandage off, you know? 3 weeks. 21 days to dismantle a life. To find somewhere to go with $1,247 a month in Social Security and medical expenses that would follow her wherever she landed. 3 weeks to figure out how to grow old gracefully when grace was apparently a luxury her family couldn't afford." Eleanor Mae nodded slowly, her dignity intact even as her heart shattered into pieces too small to count. "I'll start making calls tomorrow, Mama. Patty started, perhaps recognizing the finality in her mother's voice, the way Eleanor Mae had shifted from pleading to acceptance with the swift efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste energy fighting battles she couldn't win. "It's fine, Patricia," Eleanor Mae said, using her daughter's full name with the authority she'd once used to quiet unruly classrooms. "I understand. You have your own family to think about." But as Patty retreated to her bedroom, claiming exhaustion from the heat and the conversation, Eleanor Mae sat alone in the sweltering living room and wondered when she'd stopped being part of that family. When had love become a line item in a budget? When had 43 years of teaching, of nurturing, of giving everything she had to her community and her children become worth less than $800 a month? Outside, the Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on the mobile home park, turning the metal roofs into griddles and the air into something thick enough to swim through. Eleanor Mae closed her eyes and tried to imagine Chester beside her, tried to hear his voice telling her that everything would work out, that their daughter was just scared and overwhelmed, that family would always find a way. But Chester was gone, and family, it seemed, had found its way, straight to the conclusion that Eleanor Mae Harrison was too expensive to keep. The prescription bottle caught the light again, its orange surface gleaming like a tiny sun. $847. The cost of staying alive. The price of being unwanted. Eleanor Mae picked up the phone and began searching for the number of the first assisted living facility on her list, wondering if any of them would be able to afford her, and whether being alive was worth the cost of proving her daughter right. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The fluorescent lights of the Meadowbrook Senior Living Facility buzzed overhead like trapped insects, casting a harsh glare on the beige walls and vinyl floors that smelled of industrial disinfectant and unfulfilled promises. Eleanor Mae sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair across from Mrs. Vanessa Pruitt, the facility's intake coordinator, whose smile was as artificial as the flowers decorating her cramped office. "So, Mrs. Harrison," Vanessa said, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news for a living, "I've reviewed your financial information, and I'm afraid Meadowbrook's base rate is $2,800 per month. That doesn't include medications, personal care assistance, or our meal upgrade program." Eleanor Mae's heart sank as she did the math in her head. Even if she sold Chester's tools, even if she liquidated every penny of her modest savings, she'd be broke within 6 months. This was the third facility she'd visited in 2 days, and each one had delivered the same verdict. Her modest Social Security check made her too poor for dignity, too expensive for family, and too proud for charity. "Is there a waiting list for subsidized beds?" Eleanor Mae asked, though she already knew the answer from the apologetic expression on Vanessa's face. "Currently, we have a 14-month waiting list for our Medicaid beds," Vanessa replied, sliding a business card across the desk with the efficiency of someone eager to move on to more profitable prospects. "I'd be happy to put your name down, but I should mention that preference is given to residents who can pay privately for at least the first year." Eleanor Mae picked up the business card, its glossy surface reflecting the overhead lights like a small mirror showing her the truth of her situation. She was caught in the cruel mathematics of aging in America: too wealthy for assistance, too poor for independence, too inconvenient for family. "Thank you for your time," Eleanor Mae said, standing with the careful dignity she'd perfected over the past week of humiliating rejections. As she walked through Meadowbrook's sterile corridors, past elderly residents parked in wheelchairs like forgotten shopping carts, she wondered if this was what the end of usefulness looked like. The Alabama heat hit her like a physical blow as she stepped outside. the afternoon sun turning the parking lot into a shimmering lake of asphalt. Her 2003 Honda Civic sat alone in the visitors section, its faded blue paint and cracked dashboard testament to years of making do with less. Eleanor Mae sat behind the wheel for a long moment, letting the accumulated weight of the week settle on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patty. "How did it go? Found anything yet?" Eleanor Mae stared at the message, hearing the subtext beneath her daughter's apparent concern. 2 weeks left. The countdown had become a constant presence in her mind, ticking away like a bomb with no possibility of diffusing. She typed back, "Still looking. These things take time." The response came immediately. "Well, don't take too much time. Tyler's football equipment is due next week." Eleanor Mae turned off her phone without responding. She'd learned that silence was sometimes the only dignity left when words had lost their power to change anything. The drive back to the mobile home park took her through downtown Tuscaloosa, past the University of Alabama campus, where she'd occasionally guest lectured about children's literature during her teaching years. The sight of the red brick buildings and towering oak trees triggered a memory so vivid she had to pull over to catch her breath. It was 1987, and she'd been invited to speak to a graduate education class about reaching reluctant readers. After her presentation, a young professor named Dr. Rebecca Chen had approached her with enthusiasm shining in her dark eyes. "Mrs. Harrison, have you ever considered writing a children's book yourself? The way you talk about connecting with young minds, you have a gift for making complex ideas accessible." Eleanor Mae had laughed off the suggestion at the time, too busy with her classroom responsibilities and raising Patty to imagine herself as anything more than a teacher. But Dr. Chen had persisted, eventually becoming a friend who'd encouraged Eleanor Mae's small creative endeavors, the poetry she wrote for school newsletters, the stories she crafted for struggling students. Now, sitting in her sweltering car outside the university, Eleanor Mae found herself wondering what had happened to Rebecca Chen. Had she stayed in academia? Written books of her own? More importantly, would she remember a small-town librarian who'd shared her thoughts about reaching children through stories? It was a desperate thought, born from desperation itself, but Eleanor Mae found herself dialing directory assistance. "University of Alabama, Education Department, please." The phone rang 3 times before a cheerful voice answered. "Education Department, this is Ashley. Hello, I'm trying to reach Dr. Rebecca Chen. I'm not sure if she still works there, but..." "Oh, Dr. Chen. Yes, she's the department head now. But she's actually in a meeting right now. Could I take a message?" Eleanor Mae's heart jumped. Rebecca was still there, had even advanced to department head. Maybe, just maybe, friendship could bridge the gap that family had refused to cross. "Could you tell her Eleanor Mae Harrison called? I was a guest lecturer years ago, and I'd like to reconnect if possible." "Absolutely. Do you have a number where she can reach you?" An hour later, Eleanor Mae's phone rang with an unknown number. She answered hesitantly, bracing herself for another disappointment. "Eleanor Mae? My goodness, is it really you?" Rebecca's voice carried the same warmth Eleanor Mae remembered, now seasoned with the authority of years in academia. "Ashley said you called, and I just couldn't believe it. How long has it been?" "Too long," Eleanor Mae admitted, feeling tears threaten for the first time in days. "Rebecca, I hope you don't mind me reaching out like this, but I find myself in a rather difficult situation." "Tell me everything," Rebecca said, and something in her tone suggested she had the time and patience to listen properly. So Eleanor Mae did. She explained about Chester's death, about moving in with Patty, about the mounting medical expenses, and the impossible choice between being a burden to family or a charity case to strangers. She talked about the assisted living facilities with their waiting lists and impossibly high fees, about feeling like a problem that needed solving rather than a person who deserved dignity. Rebecca listened without interruption, making soft sounds of understanding and sympathy that reminded Eleanor Mae why their friendship had felt so natural all those years ago. "Eleanor Mae," Rebecca said when she'd finished, "I want you to know that what Patty is doing is not okay. You're not too expensive to keep. You're invaluable. And I think I might have a solution that could work for everyone. Eleanor Mae's grip tightened on the phone. What do you mean? The university has been looking for someone to develop and run a new program, a literacy initiative for at-risk children in rural Alabama. It would involve traveling to small communities, setting up reading programs, training local volunteers. The position comes with a modest salary, full benefits, and housing in one of the university's faculty cottages. Eleanor Mae felt her heart stop, then restart at double speed. Rebecca, I'm 71 years old. I haven't worked full-time in 6 years. And you have 43 years of experience making children fall in love with books. Rebecca interrupted gently. Eleanor Mae, this isn't charity. This is recognizing talent and experience when I see it. You'd be perfect for this role. Better than perfect. You'd be transformational. The word hit Eleanor Mae like lightning. Transformational. Not a burden, not an expense, not a problem to be managed. Transformational. But the board would have to approve it, Eleanor Mae said, hardly daring to hope. The university administration. Leave that to me, Rebecca said, and Eleanor Mae could hear the smile in her voice. I've been fighting for funding for this program for 2 years. Having someone of your caliber and experience would make it impossible for them to say no. Can you come in tomorrow morning? I'd like to introduce you to some people, show you what we're envisioning. Eleanor Mae looked around the mobile home park, at the rusted cars and patched roofs and children playing in dirt yards because their families couldn't afford grass. Tomorrow she could be sitting in a university office, talking about books and children and programs that could change lives. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Yes, I'll be there. That evening, Eleanor Mae sat at Patty's kitchen table with her laptop open, researching the university's faculty housing options. The cottages were small but charming, with real hardwood floors and gardens that residents were encouraged to tend. Most importantly, they came with the position. No rent, no deposits, no proving her worthiness with credit checks and financial statements. Patty emerged from her bedroom, drawn by the unusual sound of her mother typing with purpose, rather than searching desperately for somewhere to go. What are you working on? Patty asked, and there was something cautious in her voice, as if she sensed a shift in the household dynamics. A job opportunity, Eleanor Mae said, without looking up from the screen. At the university. A job? Mama, you're 71 years old. Who's going to hire someone your age? Eleanor Mae finally looked up, meeting her daughter's skeptical gaze with calm certainty. Someone who values experience over youth, wisdom over energy, and results over appearance. For the first time in months, Patty seemed unsure of herself. The confident authority she'd wielded during their confrontation about Eleanor Mae's expenses wavered slightly. What kind of job? The kind that comes with housing, Eleanor Mae said simply. The kind that makes me valuable instead of expensive. She closed the laptop and stood, moving toward her small room with more purpose than she'd felt since Chester's funeral. Behind her, she heard Patty sink into a chair at the kitchen table, perhaps beginning to realize that throwing away her mother might have been the biggest financial mistake of all. Eleanor Mae smiled as she began organizing her teaching materials for tomorrow's meeting. She'd spent 43 years helping children discover their potential. Now, at 71, she was about to discover her own. The University of Alabama's education building rose before Eleanor Mae, like a red brick fortress of possibility, its Gothic revival architecture, speaking of traditions that valued knowledge over convenience, wisdom over youth. She'd dressed carefully for this meeting, her best navy suit, the one she'd worn to Chester's funeral, now pressed and paired with the pearl earrings he'd given her for their 40th anniversary. If she was going to convince a university board that a 71-year-old woman was worth investing in, she needed every advantage dignity could provide. Dr. Rebecca Chen met her in the marble-floored lobby, and Eleanor Mae was struck by how little her friend had changed. Her hair was now silver-streaked rather than jet black, and laugh lines had appeared around her eyes. But the intellectual intensity that had drawn them together decades ago still radiated from her like heat from a forge. Eleanor Mae, you look wonderful, Rebecca said, embracing her with genuine warmth. Come on, let me show you what we're working with. They rode the elevator to the fourth floor, where Rebecca's corner office overlooked the sprawling campus quad. The walls were lined with books in 3 languages, and Eleanor Mae noticed several volumes on literacy intervention that she recognized from her own research during her teaching years. "Coffee?" Rebecca asked, gesturing to a small table set for 2. "I thought we could talk privately before I introduce you to the committee." Eleanor Mae accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that reminded her of faculty meetings from her guest lecturing days. "Rebecca, I have to ask, why me? Surely you have younger candidates, people with advanced degrees in educational outreach." Rebecca settled into the chair across from her, her expression growing serious. "Because younger candidates don't understand what we're really fighting against here. Eleanor Mae, this literacy program isn't just about teaching children to read. It's about breaking cycles of poverty that have trapped rural Alabama families for generations." She pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across the table. Charts showing literacy rates in rural counties. Maps highlighting school districts with failing reading scores. Photographs of one-room libraries in communities so small they barely registered on state educational databases. "Look at these numbers," Rebecca continued, pointing to a particularly stark chart. 63% of third graders in rural Pickens County are reading below grade level. In Sumter County, it's 71%. These children aren't stupid, Eleanor Mae. They're trapped in a system that's been designed to fail them. Eleanor Mae studied the data, her teachers heartbreaking at the magnitude of the problem. What's causing it? Funding? Partially, but it's more complex than that. Rebecca's voice took on the passion of an academic who'd spent years researching a problem others preferred to ignore. These communities have been systematically abandoned by state education policies. School consolidation closed local schools, forcing children onto hour-long bus rides that exhaust them before they even reach the classroom. Teacher recruitment programs focus on urban and suburban districts, leaving rural schools struggling with inexperienced educators who use them as stepping stones to better positions. She pulled out another set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of the Alabama State Department of Education. The state's response has been to implement standardized testing regimes that penalize schools for the very problems they haven't been given resources to solve. Schools that don't meet testing benchmarks lose funding, creating a death spiral that guarantees failure. Eleanor Mae felt a familiar fire kindling in her chest, the same passion that had driven her to stay late, helping struggling students, to fight for classroom resources when administrators preferred to spend money on sports programs. What you're describing isn't education policy, it's educational redlining. Exactly. Rebecca's eyes lit up with the recognition of finding someone who understood the deeper issues. And the communities most affected? They're predominantly African American, Native American, and poor white families, who've been voting against their own interests for decades because they've been convinced their problems come from each other rather than from systematic disinvestment. She stood and walked to a map of Alabama, pinned to her wall, marked with colored pins, indicating various demographic and educational data points. What we want to do with this literacy program is go directly into these communities and prove that their children can succeed when given proper support. But Eleanor Mae, I need you to understand, this isn't going to make you popular with certain elements of Alabama's political establishment. Eleanor Mae joined her at the map, studying the cluster of red pins that marked the counties with the most severe literacy problems. They formed a pattern she recognized from her years teaching the Black Belt region, where cotton plantations had once operated with slave labor, where the descendants of enslaved people still struggled against systems designed to keep them marginalized. Who exactly would consider this threatening? Eleanor Mae asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. Rebecca turned to meet her eyes, her expression grave. State legislators who've built their careers on the idea that throwing money at education doesn't work. School board officials who profit from testing company contracts. Politicians who need rural communities to stay desperate enough to vote against their economic interests. Eleanor Mae, if this program succeeds, it proves that Alabama's educational failures are policy choices, not inevitable outcomes. The weight of what Rebecca was proposing settled on Eleanor Mae's shoulders like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just a job opportunity. It was an invitation to become a weapon in a war she'd only dimly understood during her teaching career. "There's something else you need to know," Rebecca continued, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. The main opposition to this program has come from State Senator William Morrison's office. Morrison chairs the Education Appropriations Committee, and he's been blocking funding for rural literacy initiatives for the past 3 years. Eleanor Mae's blood chilled at the name. William Morrison, Patty's ex-father-in-law, the man whose son had abandoned Patty and the grandchildren for a gambling addiction that had destroyed their family financially. Morrison, who'd publicly blamed Patty for enabling his son's addiction, who'd used his political connections to ensure his son faced no consequences for the debts that had nearly bankrupted Patty's small family. Morrison, Eleanor Mae repeated, her voice barely audible. Senator William Morrison from Jefferson County? Rebecca's eyebrows rose in surprise. You know him? Eleanor Mae paused, calculating how much to reveal. He's my daughter's former father-in-law. There's significant bad blood between our families. Rather than being concerned, Rebecca's expression shifted to something approaching delight. Eleanor Mae, that's not a problem. That's perfect. Morrison has been dismissing this program as, quote, feel-good liberal nonsense that wastes taxpayer money on people who don't want to be helped. Having someone from his own social circle prove him wrong would be politically devastating for him. Eleanor Mae felt the pieces clicking into place with crystalline clarity. Her daughter had declared her too expensive to keep, too burdensome to love. But here was an opportunity to become invaluable to the very people Patty's family considered their enemies. To strike a blow against the man who destroyed her daughter's marriage, and then blamed her for the wreckage. Tell me about the committee meeting, Eleanor Mae said, her voice steady despite the revolution taking place in her chest. Rebecca grinned. 3 university administrators, 2 state education officials, and 1 very nervous graduate student who'll be taking notes. They're expecting to interview several candidates over the next week, but Eleanor Mae, after seeing your background and hearing about your connection to Morrison, I think this position was made for you. An hour later, Eleanor Mae sat in a conference room lined with portraits of past university presidents, facing 6 people who held her future in their collective hands. She'd presented her teaching philosophy, outlined her approach to community outreach, and answered questions about everything from transportation logistics to cultural sensitivity in diverse communities. The final question came from Dr. Marcus Williams, the Associate Dean of Community Engagement, a tall man whose careful neutrality suggested years of navigating university politics. Mrs. Harrison, this position will require you to work in communities that have been resistant to outside educational initiatives. Some of these places have deep-seated suspicions about university programs, particularly those they perceive as challenging local values or authority structures. How would you handle that kind of opposition? Eleanor Mae smiled, thinking of 43 years of winning over skeptical parents, resistant administrators, and children who'd been told they weren't smart enough to succeed. Dr. Williams, I've spent my entire career proving that every child can learn when approached with respect, patience, and genuine care. The same principles that work with reluctant 8-year-olds work with suspicious adults. You listen more than you talk, you demonstrate value before you ask for trust, and you never give up on someone just because they've given up on themselves. She paused, meeting each committee member's eyes in turn. As for challenging authority structures, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a community is show them that their children are capable of more than anyone has ever expected. That's not political, that's educational. And if certain politicians find that threatening, perhaps they should examine why they're more invested in maintaining low expectations than in celebrating high achievement. The room fell silent for a moment before Dr. Williams smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen from him all afternoon. Mrs. Harrison, when would you be available to start? The acceptance letter lay on Patty's kitchen table like a declaration of war, its University of Alabama letterhead gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light. Eleanor Mae had placed it there deliberately, knowing her daughter would see it the moment she walked through the door from her shift at the county assessor's office. The timing was perfect. Patty's supervisor had kept her late dealing with property tax appeals, which meant she'd arrive home tired, irritable, and completely unprepared for the bombshell waiting on her kitchen table. Eleanor Mae sat in the living room, ostensibly watching the evening news but actually listening for the telltale sounds of Patty's discovery. The car door slam, the heavy footsteps across the gravel, the jingle of keys, the creak of the screen door, and then silence. "Mama?" Patty's voice carried a note of confusion that quickly sharpened into suspicion. "What is this?" Eleanor Mae took her time standing, smoothing her dress with the same deliberate precision she'd once used to center herself, before delivering difficult news to students' parents. When she entered the kitchen, she found Patty holding the letter with the careful distance of someone handling potential evidence. "It's a job offer," Eleanor Mae said simply, settling into her usual chair at the kitchen table. "Full-time position with the University of Alabama, starts Monday." Patty's face cycled through several emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a calculating wariness that reminded Eleanor Mae uncomfortably of her ex-husband during his worst gambling phases. "Monday? As in 5 days from now?" Patty's voice rose slightly. "Mama, what are you talking about? You can't just get a job. You're 71 years old, you have diabetes, you need medical supervision." "I need purpose," Eleanor Mae interrupted, her voice carrying the authority she'd perfected during decades of classroom management. "Something you've made clear I won't find in this house." The accusation hung between them like smoke from a grease fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Patty set the letter down carefully, as if it might explode. "What kind of job?" Patty asked, though Eleanor Mae could see her daughter's mind already racing ahead to the implications. If Eleanor Mae had independent income, if she had her own housing, if she was no longer financially dependent. "Rural literacy outreach," Eleanor Mae replied, watching Patty's expression change as the words sank in. "I'll be developing reading programs for at-risk children in communities across Alabama. The position comes with full benefits, a university cottage, and a salary that will more than cover my medical expenses." Patty sank into the chair across from her, the fight seeming to drain out of her all at once. "How did you even know about this position? When did you have time to apply?" "Dr. Rebecca Chen contacted me," Eleanor Mae said, enjoying the way her daughter's eyes widened at the mention of a name she'd heard throughout her childhood. "She's the department head now. She specifically requested me for this role." "But the university has policies about age discrimination," Patty said weakly, grasping for some logical reason why this couldn't be happening. "They can't just hire someone your age without considering younger candidates?" Eleanor Mae smiled, and there was steel in it. "They interviewed 12 people, Patricia. 3 recent PhD graduates, 4 mid-career professionals with impressive resumes, and several experienced educators looking for new challenges. They chose me." The word "chose" landed with particular impact, and Eleanor Mae saw Patty flinch at the implicit contrast. The university had chosen her. Her own daughter had chosen to throw her away. "Where will you live?" Patty asked, though Eleanor Mae suspected she already knew the answer would eliminate any remaining leverage she might have held. "Faculty housing. A cottage on the university grounds. 2 bedrooms, full kitchen, garden space, completely furnished." Eleanor Mae paused, letting the luxury of it sink in. "No rent, no deposits. No proving my worthiness to strangers who see dollar signs instead of a person." Patty was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter as if it contained information written in a language she couldn't quite decipher. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, uncertain in a way Eleanor Mae hadn't heard since Patty was a child afraid of thunderstorms. "What about the children? Tyler and Melissa will want to visit. They'll want to see their grandmother." "Will they?" Eleanor Mae asked gently. "When was the last time either of them called? When was the last time they stopped by just to spend time with me, not because you made them?" The question hit its target with surgical precision. Tyler hadn't visited since Easter, and that had been under duress because Patty had threatened to ground him if he didn't, quote, spend time with his grandmother. Melissa had managed one awkward dinner in June, spending most of it texting her boyfriend and looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "They're teenagers," Patty said defensively. "They're busy with their own lives." "They're learning," Eleanor Mae corrected. "They're learning from you that older family members are disposable when they become inconvenient. They're learning that love has conditions and expiration dates." The accusation struck home, and Patty's defensive anger flared back to life. "That's not fair, Mama. I've been taking care of you for 18 months. I've sacrificed for you, changed my whole life to accommodate your needs. You've resented every minute of it," Eleanor Mae said quietly, "and you've made sure I knew it." The truth hung between them like a bridge neither of them wanted to cross. Patty opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, perhaps recognizing that denying Eleanor Mae's words would only prove their accuracy. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway interrupted their standoff. Through the kitchen window, Eleanor Mae could see a sleek black SUV pulling up beside Patty's aging sedan, expensive enough to stand out in their working-class neighborhood like a diamond in a coal bin. "Who is that?" Eleanor Mae asked, though something about the vehicle's aggressive luxury triggered a memory she couldn't quite place. Patty's face went pale. "Oh, God! It's William Morrison." The name hit Eleanor Mae like cold water. Senator William Morrison, the man who destroyed Patty's marriage by enabling his son's gambling addiction, then blamed Patty for the financial wreckage that had followed. Morrison, who Rebecca had identified as the primary political opponent of the literacy program Eleanor Mae was about to join. "What is he doing here?" Eleanor Mae demanded, but Patty was already moving toward the window, her body language shifting into the defensive posture of someone who'd learned to expect attack from this particular direction. Morrison emerged from the SUV like a politician stepping onto a campaign stage, silver-haired, expensively dressed, and radiating the kind of entitled authority that came from decades of unquestioned power. Even at 73, he moved with the confident stride of someone who'd never doubted his right to take up space in any room he entered. He knocked on the front door with the kind of authoritative rhythm that suggested he expected immediate response, and Patty hurried to answer with the nervous energy of someone who'd been conditioned to jump when he demanded attention. "Patricia." Morrison's voice carried the false warmth of a politician addressing a constituent he didn't particularly like but needed to placate. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced, but I've received some disturbing information that I felt needed to be addressed immediately." Eleanor Mae remained in the kitchen, listening to the conversation while staying out of sight. She'd learned decades ago that information was power, and right now she needed to understand exactly what kind of war she was walking into. "Senator Morrison, what kind of information?" Patty's voice carried the stammering uncertainty of someone who'd been knocked off balance by an unexpected attack. "About your mother's new employment situation," Morrison continued, his tone sharpening with disapproval. "I understand she's accepted a position with a university program that has been problematic for our state's educational priorities." Eleanor Mae felt her pulse quicken. Morrison knew about her job already, which meant he had sources within the university, people who were feeding him information about programs he considered threatening. "I don't understand," Patty said, though Eleanor Mae could hear the fear creeping into her daughter's voice. "Mama just got offered a teaching position. How could that be problematic?" Morrison's laugh was cold, calculated. "Patricia, your mother has agreed to work for a program designed to undermine legitimate educational policies that I've spent years developing. She's going to be working directly against the interests of hardworking Alabama families who believe in accountability and traditional values." Eleanor Mae felt a surge of fury at Morrison's casual manipulation, the way he'd transformed her commitment to helping children read into some kind of political betrayal. This was exactly the kind of rhetoric Rebecca had warned her about, turning education into a weapon in culture wars that had nothing to do with children's welfare and everything to do with maintaining power structures. "Senator Morrison, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," Patty said, her voice taking on the apologetic tone she'd perfected during her marriage to his son. "Mama would never intentionally work against educational policies." "I'm afraid there's no misunderstanding," Morrison interrupted. "The program your mother has joined is specifically designed to challenge and undermine the testing standards and accountability measures that ensure our tax dollars are being spent effectively. It's part of a broader liberal agenda to throw money at failing schools instead of demanding results." Eleanor Mae had heard enough. She stood and walked into the living room, facing Morrison with the calm dignity she'd used to handle aggressive parents during her teaching career. "Senator Morrison," she said quietly, "how lovely to finally meet you in person." Morrison's expression shifted as he took in her presence, his political instincts clearly calculating the implications of confronting her directly. "Mrs. Harrison," he said with the kind of forced courtesy that barely concealed contempt. "I was just explaining to Patricia how concerned I am about the direction of your new employment. And I'm concerned about politicians who consider teaching children to read a threat to their power," Eleanor Mae replied evenly. "But I suppose we all have our priorities." The room fell silent except for the hum of the struggling air conditioner. Morrison's face flushed slightly, recognizing that he'd just been challenged by someone who wasn't intimidated by his authority. "Mrs. Harrison, I think you may not fully understand the implications of the program you've agreed to support," Morrison said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "These initiatives have been shown to waste millions of taxpayer dollars while producing no measurable improvements in educational outcomes." Eleanor Mae smiled, and there was nothing gentle about it. "Senator Morrison, I've spent 43 years teaching children to read. I've seen what works and what doesn't. And what doesn't work is politicians who use children's futures as chess pieces in their power games." The declaration hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and Eleanor Mae watched Morrison realize that the conversation had just shifted from political maneuvering to personal confrontation. "I see," Morrison said slowly. "Well, Mrs. Harrison, I hope you understand that actions have consequences. The university program you've chosen to support will be subject to significant scrutiny from my committee. Programs that can't demonstrate clear results tend to lose their funding very quickly." "Is that a threat, Senator?" Eleanor Mae asked, her teacher's voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never backed down from a bully. "It's a statement of fact," Morrison replied. "Good day, Patricia." "Mrs. Harrison." As his SUV pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust and uncomfortable silence in its wake, Eleanor Mae turned to find Patty staring at her with a mixture of awe and terror. "Mama, what have you done?" Patty whispered. Eleanor Mae smiled, feeling more alive than she had in months. "I've made myself valuable to his enemies, sweetheart. And apparently, that makes me very dangerous indeed." The moving truck looked almost comically oversized, parked outside the university cottage, its rental company logo gleaming in the September morning sun. Eleanor Mae stood on the brick walkway, keys to her new home warm in her palm, watching two graduate students she'd hired unload the modest collection of possessions that represented 71 years of living. The cottage itself was everything Rebecca had promised and more. White clapboard siding with forest green shutters, a wraparound porch lined with hanging baskets of late summer flowers, and windows that actually opened to let in fresh air instead of the recycled staleness of central air conditioning. It sat on a tree-lined street where other faculty members walked their dogs and tended gardens that spoke of permanence rather than mere survival. "Where do you want the sewing machine, Mrs. Harrison?" asked Marcus, a doctoral student in education policy who'd volunteered to help with the move in exchange for Eleanor Mae's promise to review his dissertation chapter on rural literacy interventions. "The second bedroom, please," Eleanor Mae replied, consulting the mental floor plan she'd memorized during her 3 visits to the cottage. "That's going to be my office and craft room. An office. Her own space dedicated to intellectual work, not squeezed into a corner of someone else's living room or relegated to whatever surface happened to be temporarily available." The luxury of it still felt almost surreal. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patty. "Hope the move goes smoothly. Tyler wants to know if you'll still make him cookies for his birthday next month." Eleanor Mae stared at the message, recognizing the careful neutrality that meant Patty was testing the waters, trying to determine whether bridges had been burned beyond repair. The mention of Tyler's birthday was strategic, a reminder of family obligations that transcended whatever political drama had erupted between Eleanor Mae and Senator Morrison. She typed back, "Of course. He can visit the cottage and help me bake them. Plenty of room here for family who actually want to spend time with me." The response came quickly. "About what happened with Morrison. I didn't know he was going to show up like that." Eleanor Mae almost smiled at her daughter's attempt to distance herself from the confrontation. Patty had always been skilled at positioning herself as an innocent bystander when conflicts erupted around her, even when her own actions had created the conditions for those conflicts. "I know," Eleanor Mae replied, because arguing about it wouldn't serve any purpose. The damage was done, the lines were drawn, and now she had more important things to focus on than her daughter's capacity for self-deception. Dr. Rebecca Chen arrived just as the movers were finishing, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose gamble had paid off spectacularly. "Welcome to your new life," Rebecca said, embracing Eleanor Mae on the front porch while the graduate students carried the last boxes inside. "How does it feel to be a dangerous political radical?" Eleanor Mae laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet street like birdsong. "Liberating, actually. I haven't felt this useful in years." They settled on the porch swing with glasses of champagne, watching the university campus come alive with the energy of the fall semester. Students hurried between classes with backpacks and laptops, faculty members engaged in animated discussions about research and teaching, and somewhere in the distance, the carillon in the library tower chimed the hour with stately precision. "I have news," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the excitement of someone who'd been waiting all morning to share good information. "The first site visit is scheduled for Monday, Pickens County, specifically the community of Aliceville. School enrollment is down 40% from 10 years ago. Standardized test scores are in the bottom 5th percentile statewide, and the local library has been closed for 3 years due to budget cuts." Eleanor Mae felt her pulse quicken with anticipation. This was why she'd taken the job, not for the comfortable cottage or the steady salary, but for the chance to prove that written-off children in forgotten communities could succeed when given proper support. "What's the political situation there?" Eleanor Mae asked, remembering Morrison's veiled threats about scrutiny and consequences. Rebecca's expression grew more serious. "Complex. The county school board has been pushing for full consolidation, closing the remaining local schools and busing all students to a regional facility 30 miles away. Morrison's been supporting that effort, arguing that consolidation will improve efficiency and reduce per-pupil costs. And the community? Split along predictable lines. Older residents want to keep the local school open for cultural and practical reasons. Younger families are divided between those who think consolidation might mean better resources and those who worry about their children spending 3 hours a day on a bus. The African American community is particularly skeptical of any plan that requires their children to travel to a school district with a history of racial tensions." Eleanor Mae nodded, recognizing the complex dynamics that had shaped rural education politics throughout her career. "What about local leadership? Who am I going to be working with?" Rebecca pulled out a folder thick with background information. "The principal is Angela Davis, no relation to the famous one," she's quick to point out. 28 years old, grew up in Aliceville, went away to college at Auburn, came back specifically to try to save her childhood school. She's brilliant, dedicated, and completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she's fighting against. The name Angela Davis resonated with Eleanor Mae in a way that had nothing to do with the famous civil rights activist. She'd known dozens of Angela Davises during her career, young teachers and administrators who'd returned to their struggling communities with fresh degrees and fierce determination, only to discover that good intentions collided brutally with entrenched systems designed to maintain failure. "She's been asking for literacy intervention support for 2 years," Rebecca continued. "The State Department keeps telling her they don't have funding for specialized programs in schools with such low enrollment. Morrison's committee has blocked 3 separate grant applications." Eleanor Mae felt the familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same passion that had driven her to stay late helping struggling students even when administrators complained about overtime costs. "How many children are we talking about?" 87 students in grades K through 12, 32 of them reading below grade level according to last year's assessments. But Eleanor Mae, those assessments are based on standardized tests that don't account for cultural differences, economic stress, or the fact that many of these children are dealing with food insecurity and unstable housing situations. The statistics painted a picture Eleanor Mae recognized from her years in under-resourced schools, children whose potential was being measured against metrics that had never been designed to capture their actual capabilities. Standardized tests that penalized students for speaking in dialects, for having different cultural reference points, for the crime of being poor, in a system that equated poverty with stupidity. "What kind of resources will I have?" Eleanor Mae asked, already mentally cataloging the materials and approaches she'd want to bring to the community. The university is providing a mobile library unit, essentially a converted RV, stocked with age-appropriate books and basic technology. You'll have a budget for supplementary materials, and the education department has agreed to provide graduate student assistance on a rotating basis. Most importantly, you'll have academic freedom to develop whatever approaches you think will work best for each community. Academic freedom. The phrase hit Eleanor Mae like sunshine after months of clouds. No standardized curriculum mandated by politicians who'd never worked with children. No testing requirements that forced teachers to spend months preparing students for examinations that measured compliance rather than learning. No administrators demanding she justify every creative approach with data that reduced children to numbers on a spreadsheet. "There's one more thing," Rebecca said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Morrison doesn't know about the mobile library unit yet. As far as his office knows, this is just a small pilot program with minimal resources. We've been deliberately vague about the scope and funding." Eleanor Mae raised an eyebrow. "Strategic deception?" "Strategic information management," Rebecca corrected with a grin. "If Morrison knew how comprehensive this program actually is, he'd find ways to block it before we could demonstrate results. This way, by the time he realizes what we're really doing, we'll have data showing student improvement that will be very difficult for him to argue against." The plan was elegant in its simplicity, proved the program's value before its enemies could mobilize to destroy it. Eleanor Mae felt a surge of admiration for Rebecca's political acumen, the way she'd learned to navigate university and state politics without compromising her educational principles. "When do I meet with Principal Davis?" Eleanor Mae asked. "Tomorrow. She's driving up here for a planning session." "Eleanor Mae, I should warn you, she's been burned by promises before. The state sent a literacy consultant 3 years ago who spent 2 weeks conducting assessments, wrote a report recommending resources the school couldn't afford, and never came back. Angela's going to be skeptical until you prove you're different." Eleanor Mae smiled, thinking of all the skeptical parents and resistant students she'd won over during her career. Trust wasn't something you demanded or expected. It was something you earned through consistent action and genuine care. "That's fine," she said. "Skepticism is just wisdom that hasn't found its target yet. Give me time to show her what's possible." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the cottage porch, Eleanor Mae felt a deep sense of rightness settle into her bones. For the first time since Chester's funeral, she was exactly where she belonged, not because someone else had decided to keep her, but because she'd proven herself valuable enough to choose. Her phone buzzed with another text, this one from an unknown number. "Mrs. Harrison, this is Angela Davis. Dr. Chen gave me your number. I wanted to say thank you for taking on this project. These children deserve someone who believes in them. Looking forward to working with you." Eleanor Mae typed back quickly. "Ms. Davis, the pleasure is mine. I've spent my career proving that every child can succeed when given proper support. Tomorrow, we start showing Alabama what's possible when we stop making excuses and start making miracles." As she hit send, Eleanor Mae realized that for the first time in months, she was looking forward to tomorrow. Not just surviving it, not just getting through it, but actively anticipating the chance to prove her worth through action rather than apology. Senator Morrison had made her his enemy because he saw her as a threat to his political agenda. He had no idea how right he was. The road to Aliceville stretched through Alabama countryside that looked like a postcard from a more hopeful era. Rolling hills dotted with farmhouses, stands of pine trees that whispered secrets in the morning breeze, and fields where cotton plants stood in neat rows like soldiers waiting for orders. But Eleanor Mae's trained eye caught the signs of economic distress hidden beneath the pastoral beauty. Abandoned barns with sagging roofs, for sale signs grown faded and forgotten, and houses where prosperity had clearly packed up and moved away years ago. The mobile library unit handled the winding county roads with surprising grace, its converted RV chassis carrying thousands of books and educational materials toward what Rebecca had warned might be hostile territory. Eleanor Mae gripped the steering wheel with the steady confidence of someone who'd navigated worse challenges than suspicious rural communities, like 43 years of skeptical parents and resistant administrators who'd learned to underestimate the quiet determination of librarians and teachers. Aliceville Elementary School appeared around a bend like a mirage of faded hope, a single-story brick building from the 1960s, its parking lot cracked and weedy, its playground equipment showing rust spots that spoke of deferred maintenance and shrinking budgets. But the American flag flying from the flagpole was crisp and new, and someone had planted flower boxes beneath the front windows with marigolds that blazed orange and yellow against the weathered brick. Principal Angela Davis met Eleanor Mae in the gravel parking lot, and the first thing that struck her was how young the woman looked, barely 30, with the kind of earnest intensity that came from believing you could save the world one child at a time. She wore a simple blue dress that had probably come from Walmart, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who understood that respect was earned through action, not wardrobe. "Mrs. Harrison," Angela said, extending her hand with a firm grip that suggested steel beneath the soft Southern accent. "I have to admit, when Dr. Chen told me they were sending someone with your experience, I wasn't sure what to expect. Most consultants who come through here spend more time looking at our test scores than our children." Eleanor Mae smiled, recognizing the defensive wariness in Angela's voice, the careful politeness of someone who'd been disappointed by too many experts who'd arrived with theories but left without solutions. "Ms. Davis, I've spent my career believing that children are always more important than the numbers we use to measure them. Why don't you show me around and tell me what you think these particular children need?" The tour that followed was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Classrooms with 30-year-old textbooks and ceiling tiles that sagged from roof leaks, but walls covered with student artwork and achievement certificates that spoke of teachers who refused to let inadequate resources crush their expectations. A library with empty shelves where books should have been, but reading corners created from donated furniture where children could still discover the magic of stories. "We lost our librarian position 3 years ago," Angela explained, as they stood in the eerily quiet space that had once been the heart of the school's learning community. "Budget cuts. The county said we could share a librarian with 3 other schools, but that meant she'd be here 1 day a week if we were lucky." Eleanor Mae ran her fingers along the empty shelves, feeling the ghost of all the stories that had once lived here. "What happened to the books? Some went to other schools that still had librarians. Some got donated to churches and community centers. A lot of them just—" Angela's voice trailed off, and Eleanor Mae understood. Books without readers became casualties of budget cuts, their potential reduced to recycling or landfill. "Ms. Davis," Eleanor Mae said quietly, "would you mind gathering your faculty? I'd like to meet them before we start working with the children." 20 minutes later, Eleanor Mae stood before 7 teachers in what had once been the school library, facing the kind of weary professionalism she recognized from her own years in under-resourced schools. These were educators who'd learned to perform miracles with nothing, who'd spent their own money on classroom supplies and their own time on struggling students, who'd watched bureaucrats make decisions about education without ever setting foot in an actual classroom. "I know you're wondering who I am and why I'm here," Eleanor Mae began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned respect in similar rooms filled with similar skepticism. "I'm Eleanor Mae Harrison. I've been teaching children to read for 43 years, and I'm here because someone in Montgomery decided your students don't deserve the same opportunities as children in wealthier districts." The directness of her statement seemed to catch the teachers off guard. Most consultants began with platitudes about partnership and collaboration. Eleanor Mae was starting with acknowledgement of the political reality that shaped their daily struggles. "I'm not here to fix your test scores," she continued. "I'm not here to implement someone else's curriculum, or measure your effectiveness against standards designed by people who've never worked with your students. I'm here to help you prove that these children can succeed when given proper support, and to make sure the people who've been denying them that support have to answer for their choices." A hand rose from the back of the room. Mrs. Carla Williams, a fifth-grade teacher whose gray hair and lined face spoke of decades spent fighting for her students. Mrs. Harrison, we've heard promises before. The state sends consultants who talk about research-based interventions and data-driven instruction, but they never address the fact that our students are coming to school hungry, that their parents work 3 jobs and can't help with homework, that we're trying to teach reading to children who don't have books at home. Eleanor Mae nodded, recognizing the frustration in Mrs. Williams' voice, the exhaustion that came from being blamed for problems you didn't create and couldn't solve with the resources you'd been given. Mrs. Williams, you're absolutely right. And that's exactly why the mobile library is parked outside right now, stocked with books these children can take home and keep. It's why I'm going to be spending time in this community, not just in this school, helping families understand how they can support their children's learning without needing college degrees or extra hours in their day. Another teacher spoke up. Mr. James Peterson, who taught 3rd and 4th grade in a combined classroom because enrollment had dropped below the threshold for separate classes. What about the consolidation plan? Word is that Senator Morrison's committee is going to force us to close next year anyway. Why invest time and resources in a school that might not exist in 12 months? The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acknowledging the elephant in the room that everyone had been too polite to mention. Eleanor Mae felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, someone was ready to discuss the real stakes of what they were doing. Mr. Peterson, that's exactly why we're here, she said, her voice taking on the steel she'd once used to face down hostile school board meetings. Senator Morrison wants to close this school because he believes rural children can't achieve at the same level as their suburban counterparts. He's using your students' test scores as evidence that small schools are inherently ineffective. She paused, looking around the room at teachers who'd dedicated their careers to proving that belief wrong. What if we could demonstrate significant improvement in reading achievement over the next 6 months? What if we could show that your students, given proper support, can meet or exceed state standards? How difficult would it be for Senator Morrison to justify closing a school that's producing documented success? The silence that followed was different from the skeptical quiet that had greeted her arrival. This was the silence of people recognizing possibility where they'd seen only inevitability. Angela Davis spoke first, her young voice carrying a determination that reminded Eleanor Mae of her own early teaching years. What would you need from us? Partnership, Eleanor Mae replied immediately. Not compliance, not implementation of my ideas, but genuine collaboration based on your knowledge of these children and this community. You know things about effective teaching that no university consultant can learn from research studies. I know things about literacy intervention that might be new to you. Together, we might accomplish something neither of us could do alone. Mrs. Williams raised her hand again. And when Senator Morrison's people start asking questions about our methods, about whether we're following approved curricula and testing protocols, Eleanor Mae smiled, and there was something fierce in it. Let them ask. Academic freedom means we get to use whatever approaches work best for our students, as long as we can demonstrate results. And Mrs. Williams, I suspect the results are going to be very difficult for anyone to argue with. As the meeting broke up and teachers returned to their classrooms with an energy that hadn't been there an hour earlier, Angela Davis lingered behind. Mrs. Harrison, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why are you really here? I mean, you could be enjoying retirement, spending time with your family, not driving around rural Alabama fighting political battles that most people your age would rather avoid. Eleanor Mae looked through the library window at the mobile unit parked outside, at the children playing on the worn playground equipment, at the community that politicians had written off as too expensive to save. Ms. Davis, 6 weeks ago my own daughter told me I was too expensive to keep. She made me feel worthless, used up, a burden that was dragging her family down. Eleanor Mae's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. Now I'm working for people who consider Senator Morrison their enemy, helping children he's decided aren't worth investing in. It turns out that being declared worthless by some people just means you're priceless to their opponents. Angela's eyes widened as she processed the implications of what Eleanor Mae had just revealed. You're not just here to improve reading scores, are you? Eleanor Mae's smile was sharp as a blade. Oh, we're definitely going to improve reading scores. But you're right, that's not all I'm here to do. Senator Morrison spent years making sure these children don't get the resources they need to succeed. Now I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly whose policies created the problems we're about to solve. Outside, the September afternoon was beginning to cool, and Eleanor Mae could hear the sound of children's laughter from the playground. It was the sound of hope, young and resilient, and completely unaware that its future was being decided by adults who'd never bothered to ask what those children might be capable of achieving. Tomorrow the real work would begin, and Senator Morrison was about to discover what happened when you underestimated a 71-year-old librarian who'd finally found her battlefield. 3 weeks into the Aliceville intervention, Eleanor Mae stood in what had once been an empty library, now transformed into a buzzing hive of literacy activity. 8-year-old Jasmine Washington sat curled in a beanbag chair, completely absorbed in a picture book about a girl who looked like her, while 10-year-old Marcus Thompson worked with graduate student assistant Sarah Kim on phonics exercises that had been adapted to include vocabulary from his grandfather's farming stories. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Eleanor Mae had spent the first week simply observing, watching how children moved through their school day, noting which students struggled with traditional teaching methods, identifying the informal leaders among both faculty and students who could help bridge the gap between innovation and acceptance. She'd learned that Marcus was brilliant with mechanical concepts, but had been labeled learning disabled because standardized assessments couldn't measure his understanding of complex agricultural machinery. She'd discovered that Jasmine could solve math problems in her head, but froze when asked to write down her reasoning because no one had ever taught her that her way of thinking was valid. "Mrs. Harrison?" Angela Davis appeared at her elbow, clipboard in hand, and excitement barely contained in her professional demeanor. "You need to see these numbers." Eleanor Mae accepted the assessment results with the careful attention she'd learned to give data that might determine children's futures. The preliminary reading evaluations showed progress that even she hadn't dared hope for so quickly. Average improvements of 1.3 grade levels in just 3 weeks, with some students showing gains of nearly 2 full grade levels. "These are remarkable," Eleanor Mae said, though she kept her voice low to avoid disrupting the focused work happening around them. "But Angela, we need to be careful about how we present this information. Rapid early gains often level off as interventions become routine." "I understand," Angela replied, but her smile suggested she was having trouble containing her optimism. "Still, Mrs. Harrison, some of these children haven't shown any measurable reading improvement in 2 years. Their parents are starting to ask what we're doing differently." That was exactly what Eleanor Mae had been hoping to hear. Parent engagement was the secret weapon that politicians like Morrison never factored into their educational calculations. The power of families who suddenly believed their children could succeed, who started reinforcing learning at home because they'd been given tools that actually worked. Her phone buzzed with an urgent text from Rebecca. "Emergency meeting, my office. Morrison's making moves, come now." Eleanor Mae felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. She'd been expecting political pushback, but 3 weeks seemed too early for Morrison to have gathered enough information to mount a serious challenge. "Angela, I need to drive back to Tuscaloosa for a meeting with Dr. Chen. Can you handle the afternoon session?" "Of course," Angela said, though concern flickered across her features. "Is everything okay?" "I hope so," Eleanor Mae replied, though her instincts suggested otherwise. "Keep documenting everything: attendance, engagement levels, parent feedback. If anyone comes asking questions while I'm gone, just stick to the facts and refer them to the university." The drive back to campus gave Eleanor Mae too much time to think about what kind of opposition Morrison might be organizing. She'd been careful to follow all university protocols, had documented every expenditure and decision, had maintained scrupulous records of student progress and parent consent. But she'd also learned during her teaching career that determined politicians could find problems with the most carefully managed programs if they were motivated to look hard enough. Rebecca's office felt different when Eleanor Mae arrived. Tense, with the kind of barely controlled urgency that suggested crisis management mode. 2 people she didn't recognize sat at the conference table alongside Rebecca, their expensive suits and careful neutrality marking them as university administrators with serious concerns. "Eleanor Mae, thank you for coming so quickly," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the strain of someone who'd been fighting bureaucratic battles all morning. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Patricia Henley, Associate Provost for External Relations, and Mr. David Richardson, the university's General Counsel." Eleanor Mae shook hands with both, noting the way they assessed her with the calculating attention of people determining whether she was an asset or a liability to their institution. "Mrs. Harrison," Dr. Henley began without preamble, We've received some concerning communications from Senator Morrison's office regarding the literacy program. Specifically, questions about whether the program is operating within the scope of its approved mandate, and whether university resources are being used for political purposes. Eleanor Mae felt a familiar flash of anger at the suggestion that helping children learn to read constituted political activity. But she kept her voice level. Could you be more specific about Senator Morrison's concerns? Mr. Richardson consulted a legal pad covered with notes. He's alleging that the program is deliberately undermining state educational standards by using unapproved curricula, that university personnel are engaging in political advocacy by criticizing state testing policies, and that the mobile library unit constitutes an unauthorized use of state funding. Each accusation was carefully crafted to sound reasonable while being fundamentally dishonest, Eleanor Mae realized. Morrison was using bureaucratic language to disguise what was essentially an attack on any educational approach that threatened his political narrative. Mr. Richardson, Eleanor Mae said carefully, are any of those allegations factually accurate? No, Rebecca interjected before the lawyer could respond. Eleanor Mae, you've been operating completely within your authorized parameters. The curricula you're using are research-based and have been approved by the Education Department. You haven't criticized state testing policies, you've simply focused on improving student outcomes. And the mobile library was purchased with federal grant funding specifically designated for rural literacy initiatives. Dr. Henley leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but concerned. Mrs. Harrison, the accuracy of the allegations isn't really the issue. Senator Morrison chairs the committee that reviews state funding for the university. If he decides to make this program a political issue, it could have implications far beyond your specific position. Eleanor Mae understood the subtext immediately. The university was asking her to consider whether her personal battle with Morrison was worth the potential risk to broader institutional interests. It was the same calculation she'd seen administrators make throughout her career: sacrifice individual programs or personnel to protect larger organizational goals. What exactly are you asking me to do? Eleanor Mae asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. We're asking you to consider whether some strategic modifications to the program might address Senator Morrison's concerns, Dr. Henley replied diplomatically, perhaps focusing more narrowly on traditional literacy interventions, avoiding any approaches that might be perceived as challenging established educational policies. Eleanor Mae looked around the table at three people who meant well, but had apparently forgotten that compromise with bullies rarely led to anything but more aggressive bullying. Dr. Henley, with all due respect, I didn't take this position to implement watered-down programs that don't threaten anyone's political agenda. I took it to prove that children in rural Alabama can succeed when given proper support. Strategic modifications that avoid challenging failed policies aren't going to help those children. They're just going to preserve the status quo that's been failing them for years. The room fell silent, and Eleanor Mae could see the administrators processing her refusal to bend to political pressure. She'd seen this moment before, in different contexts, the point where institutions had to choose between their stated values and their political survival. Rebecca broke the silence, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made her decision. Eleanor Mae's right. If we start modifying educational programs based on political pressure rather than student needs, we're not serving our mission as a university. Mr. Richardson looked uncomfortable. Dr. Chen, I understand your educational principles, but we need to consider the practical implications. Senator Morrison has significant influence over state funding formulas. Then we need to make sure our results are so impressive that cutting our funding becomes politically impossible, Eleanor Mae interrupted. Mr. Richardson, in 3 weeks we've documented reading improvements that most intervention programs take months to achieve. Children who were labeled as learning disabled are reading at grade level. Parents who'd given up on their local school are asking how they can get more involved. She pulled out her phone and showed them the photos Angela had been sending. Children engaged in reading activities, parents volunteering in classrooms, teachers collaborating on lessons with enthusiasm that hadn't been visible in years. This is what success looks like, Eleanor Mae continued. If Senator Morrison wants to attack a program that's demonstrably helping children succeed, let him try. But I suspect he's going to find it harder to justify opposition to documented educational improvement than he expects. Dr. Henley studied the photos with the careful attention of someone calculating political risks and benefits. Mrs. Harrison, what if Morrison escalates his opposition? What if he starts demanding detailed investigations, bringing in state auditors, making this a public controversy? Eleanor Mae smiled, and there was steel in it. Dr. Henley, I'm 71 years old, and 6 weeks ago my own daughter told me I was too expensive to keep. I've got nothing left to lose and everything to prove. If Senator Morrison wants to make this a public fight about whether rural children deserve quality education, I'm ready for that conversation. The meeting ended with cautious agreement that the program would continue as planned, but Eleanor Mae could see the concern in the administrator's eyes. They were committed to supporting her work, but they were also calculating the potential costs of defying a powerful politician. As she drove back to Aliceville that afternoon, Eleanor Mae's phone rang with a call from an unknown number. Mrs. Harrison, this is Jennifer Walsh from Alabama Public Television. I'm working on a story about rural education initiatives, and I understand you're running an innovative literacy program. Would you be willing to talk with me? Eleanor Mae pulled over to take the call properly, recognizing the opportunity that had just presented itself. Morrison might have political influence, but he'd apparently forgotten that positive stories about children succeeding were much harder to attack than abstract policy discussions. Ms. Walsh, I'd be delighted to talk with you, but I think you should speak with the children and families in Aliceville first. Their stories are much more important than anything I could tell you about educational theory. As she hung up and continued driving toward the school where children were discovering they were smarter than anyone had ever told them, Eleanor Mae realized that Morrison's attack might have backfired. By trying to suppress a successful program, he'd potentially drawn media attention to its achievements. She was no longer just helping children learn to read. She was creating a narrative that could challenge the entire political framework Morrison had built his career on. And the best part was, every word of it was true. The Alabama Public Television crew had been filming at Aliceville Elementary for 2 hours, and Eleanor Mae watched from the back of the classroom as 8-year-old Jasmine Washington read aloud from a chapter book that would have been impossible for her 6 months ago. The camera captured not just her fluent reading but the confidence in her posture, the way she paused to explain difficult words to younger students, the pride that radiated from her like sunlight. Mrs. Harrison taught us that being smart doesn't look the same for everybody, Jasmine was saying to reporter Jennifer Walsh. Some people are smart with numbers, some people are smart with their hands, and some people are smart with stories. But everybody's smart at something. Eleanor Mae felt tears threaten behind her eyes. This was what Morrison's policies had nearly destroyed. Not just reading scores, but children's fundamental belief in their own capacity to learn and grow and contribute to the world. The segment would air tonight on the statewide evening news, part of a special investigation into rural education funding that had grown far beyond Jennifer Walsh's original story idea. What had started as a simple feature about innovative teaching methods had evolved into a comprehensive examination of how political decisions affected real children in forgotten communities. Principal Angela Davis appeared at Eleanor Mae's elbow, carrying an envelope with the State Department of Education seal. "This came by certified mail this morning," she said quietly. "It's addressed to you." Eleanor Mae accepted the envelope with steady hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Official correspondence from the State Education Department rarely brought good news to programs that challenged established policies. The letter was brief and formal. "Mrs. Harrison, your literacy intervention program at Aliceville Elementary has been selected for comprehensive evaluation by the State Assessment Review Committee. This evaluation will examine all aspects of program implementation, funding utilization, and student outcomes measurement. The review team will arrive Monday, December 15th, and will require full access to all program materials, assessment data, and financial records." It was dated and signed by Dr. Marcus Thompson, State Superintendent of Education, Morrison's hand-picked ally, who'd spent 3 years implementing policies designed to justify school closures rather than prevent them. "They're coming to shut us down," Angela said, reading the tension in Eleanor Mae's expression. Morrison's finally making his move. Eleanor Mae folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her purse. "Maybe, Or maybe he's giving us exactly the platform we need to demonstrate what's possible when you stop making excuses and start making miracles. The truth was, Eleanor Mae had been expecting this escalation. The television story had attracted national attention. Education bloggers, policy researchers, and rural advocacy groups had all begun citing Aliceville as proof that small schools could achieve remarkable results when given proper support. Morrison's committee couldn't ignore that level of scrutiny, which meant they needed to either embrace the program's success or discredit it entirely. "What do we do?" Angela asked, and Eleanor Mae heard the fear beneath her professional composure. This young principal had poured her heart into saving her childhood school, and now it felt like everything hung in the balance of a political review designed to find fault rather than celebrate success. "We tell the truth," Eleanor Mae said simply. "We show them exactly what we've accomplished, and let them try to argue with results that speak for themselves." That evening, Eleanor Mae sat in her university cottage, watching the Alabama Public Television special with Rebecca Chen, and a living room full of education faculty who'd gathered to see their rural literacy initiative receive statewide coverage. The program was everything they'd hoped for and more: compelling footage of children reading with joy and confidence, interviews with parents who'd become advocates for their local school, and data showing academic improvements that even skeptics couldn't dismiss. But the most powerful moment came at the end, when Jennifer Walsh interviewed Eleanor Mae herself. "Mrs. Harrison, critics have suggested that this program is more about politics than education, that you're using these children to advance a particular ideological agenda. How do you respond to that?" Eleanor Mae looked directly into the camera, her 71-year-old face calm with the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime proving her worth through action rather than rhetoric. "Ms. Walsh, 6 months ago my own daughter told me I was too expensive to keep. She reduced my value to a line item in her budget and decided I wasn't worth the cost of my medical care. I came to this program believing I had nothing left to offer, that my years of experience and dedication meant nothing in a world that measures worth in dollars and cents." She paused, letting the personal revelation settle before continuing. These children in Aliceville were being told the same thing by politicians who decided their education wasn't worth proper funding, that their potential didn't justify investment, that their futures were too expensive to prioritize. But you know what we've discovered together? When you stop measuring people's worth by their cost and start recognizing their value, remarkable things become possible. The camera lingered on her face as she delivered her final words. "I'm not here to advance anyone's political agenda. I'm here to prove that every child deserves to discover their own brilliance, and that rural communities can produce scholars and leaders and innovators when given the same resources as wealthy suburbs. If that's political, then I suppose believing in human potential has become a radical act." The program ended with updated footage of the Aliceville students, now reading at or above grade level, and a graphic showing the 200% improvement in standardized test scores that had made Morrison's consolidation arguments mathematically impossible to support. Eleanor Mae's phone began ringing before the credits finished rolling. Calls from other rural principals asking about replicating the program, from education researchers requesting data, from parents in communities facing similar consolidation threats. But the call that mattered most came from her grandson Tyler. "Grandma Eleanor?" His 16-year-old voice carried a maturity she hadn't heard before. "I just watched your interview on TV. Mom's been crying for the past hour." Eleanor Mae's breath caught. "What kind of crying, sweetheart?" "The bad kind. The guilty kind. She knows what she did to you was wrong, and now she's seeing you on television helping all these kids, and she realizes she threw away something incredible because she was scared about money." Through the background noise, Eleanor Mae could hear Patty's voice, thick with tears. "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I'm proud of her. Tell her I was wrong about everything." Eleanor Mae closed her eyes, feeling the complex mix of vindication and sadness that came with being proven right about something that had cost so much to demonstrate. "Tyler, honey, tell your mother that families make mistakes, but love finds ways to heal if people are willing to do the work. I'm not angry anymore. I'm grateful. Being told I was too expensive to keep led me to discover I was priceless to people who actually needed what I had to offer." The state evaluation team arrived on schedule, armed with clipboards and skepticism and the bureaucratic authority to find problems with programs that threatened established narratives. They spent 3 days reviewing every aspect of Eleanor Mae's work, interviewing students, testing reading levels, examining financial records, questioning methodology. But they couldn't argue with third-grader Marcus Thompson reading at 6th grade level, or with parent attendance at school events increasing by 400%, or with standardized test scores that had improved so dramatically that the State Department would have to revise its statistical models for rural school performance. Dr. Marcus Thompson, the state superintendent, delivered the evaluation results personally, an unusual gesture that suggested political considerations had trumped normal bureaucratic procedures. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, his voice careful and neutral, "the review committee has concluded that the Aliceville literacy intervention represents a significant educational achievement. The documented improvements in student outcomes exceed anything we've seen in similar programs." Eleanor Mae waited for the "but" that she knew was coming. However, Dr. Thompson continued, "The committee has concerns about the sustainability and scalability of this approach. The intensive, individualized nature of the intervention may not be replicable across larger numbers of schools or students." It was a face-saving formula, Eleanor Mae realized. Acknowledge the success while maintaining that it couldn't be replicated broadly enough to challenge existing policies. Morrison's influence was still strong enough to prevent wholesale adoption of approaches that would make his educational philosophy obsolete. "Dr. Thompson," Eleanor Mae said quietly, "are you recommending that we discontinue this program despite its documented success?" "Not discontinue," he replied carefully, "but perhaps contain its scope to avoid unrealistic expectations about what's possible in other communities." Eleanor Mae smiled, recognizing the political calculation behind his words. Morrison couldn't shut down a successful program without looking like he opposed children's achievement. But he could limit its influence by quarantining it as a special case rather than a replicable model. "I understand," she said. "Of course, the television coverage and media attention have already led to requests from 47 other communities for similar programs. I suppose we'll need to let them know that the State Department doesn't consider student success to be replicable." Dr. Thompson's expression shifted as he processed the trap she'd just laid. Saying that successful educational interventions couldn't be replicated elsewhere would be political suicide, but approving expansion would validate everything Morrison had spent years arguing against. "Mrs. Harrison, I think perhaps we need to revisit our initial assessment of program scalability." 6 months later, Eleanor Mae stood in the state capitol building, watching Governor Patricia Mitchell sign legislation creating the Alabama Rural Literacy Initiative, a statewide program based on the Aliceville model that would bring intensive reading support to every small school in the state. Senator Morrison sat in the front row of observers, his face carefully neutral as he applauded legislation that represented the complete repudiation of his educational philosophy. He'd tried to block the bill, but the combination of documented student success, media attention, and parental advocacy had made opposition politically impossible. "Mrs. Harrison," Governor Mitchell said as she handed Eleanor Mae the ceremonial pen used to sign the legislation, "this program represents the best of Alabama's commitment to educational excellence. Your work has proven that our children's potential is limited only by our willingness to invest in their success." As cameras flashed and education advocates applauded, Eleanor Mae thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From being declared too expensive to keep by her own daughter, to becoming the architect of statewide education policy. It was a transformation that would have seemed impossible just 18 months ago. Her phone buzzed with a text from Angela Davis. "Enrollment at Aliceville Elementary is up 40% this year. Families are moving back to the community because they believe in the school again. Thank you for showing us what was possible." Another message came from Patty. "Saw you on the news again. Tyler and Melissa want to spend Christmas with you at the cottage. We're all proud of who you've become. Can you forgive who I was?" Eleanor Mae smiled as she typed back, "Already forgiven. Love doesn't have expiration dates, even when it gets temporarily misplaced. See you Christmas morning." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor Mae found herself face to face with Senator Morrison. For a moment, neither of them spoke, two people who'd fought a battle that had defined both their legacies. Mrs. Harrison, Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd lost a war he'd been certain he would win. I suppose congratulations are in order. Senator Morrison, Eleanor Mae replied with the grace she'd learned from 43 years of dealing with difficult people. I hope you'll find ways to support the children who will benefit from this program. They never asked to be political symbols. They just wanted someone to believe they were worth the investment. As Morrison walked away, shoulders slightly stooped with the weight of defeat, Eleanor Mae reflected on the strange mathematics of worth and value that had shaped both their stories. He'd built a career arguing that some children were too expensive to save. She'd built a legacy proving that every child was priceless when given proper support. The difference, she realized, wasn't just in their educational philosophies. It was in their understanding of what it meant to be valuable. Morrison had confused cost with worth, had mistaken political convenience for moral authority. Eleanor Mae had learned that true value came from giving people what they needed to discover their own potential. At 72, she was no longer the woman who'd been declared too expensive to keep. She was Eleanor Mae Harrison, architect of educational policy, champion of rural communities, and living proof that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the simple recognition that everyone deserves to be valued for who they are, rather than dismissed for what they cost. The war was over, and love, stubborn, persistent, transformative love, had won. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. That.